It was just a flash drive, plugged into a shared laptop in a university classroom in Arlington, Texas. 5 college students, most of them in their early 20s, one of them a late 20s woman who used to flip pancakes at an all-day breakfast chain, clicked it open and stared at what loaded on the screen. 400 pages of a murder case. A case the police had been unable to solve for 34 years. A case involving a young mother, a love triangle, a body discovered decomposing in a rural Texas field, and a suspect who, for reasons that would stun everyone, had somehow slipped through the cracks of the justice system for over 3 decades. These students had never looked at a criminal case file before in their lives, and within 2 weeks of cracking it open, they had done something a veteran homicide detective could not. But here's the thing. What happened next is where the story gets really complicated. Stay with me, because this story has more twists than you were ready for. This is the murder of Cynthia Renee Gonzalez. To understand this case, you have to understand who Cynthia Renee Gonzalez actually was. Not just the crime scene details, not just the cold, bureaucratic language of a police report, but who this woman was in the world. And the answer, by every account, is someone worth fighting for. Growing up in Fort Worth, Texas, Cynthia Renee Gandy was the kind of girl everybody knew. Popular, athletic, bright-eyed, and full of life, with long, teased auburn hair that was absolutely perfectly 1980s Texas. Her friends called her Cindy. Her high school called her their junior class queen. But her life wasn't easy. Her father wasn't in the picture, and her mother Linda Gandy struggled to hold things together. When the family moved neighborhoods, something shifted in Cynthia's path. She dropped out of Fort Worth's Carter Riverside High School during her senior year in 1984, just months before graduation. 4 months after dropping out, 18 years old and pregnant, she married a man named Donald Gonzalez, who was nearly 7 years her senior, and that December, her daughter Jessica was born. In that little girl, Cynthia found her whole world. By every account, Cynthia was a devoted, hands-on mother. She enrolled Jessica in cheer and dance classes. They went camping. They spent summer days boating out on Eagle Mountain Lake down the street from their home in Azle, a small suburb on the northwestern fringe of Fort Worth. Friends remember Cynthia being deeply committed to her daughter, even as her marriage crumbled around her. By 1991, after more than 6 years together, Cynthia and Donald's marriage was over, and she had moved out of the Azle house into a modest apartment in Arlington, a massive, sprawling suburb wedged between Dallas and Fort Worth, home to the Texas Rangers and the Cowboys, and about 400,000 people trying to get through their lives. And in that apartment, Cynthia was building something new. She worked nights as an exotic dancer at a venue called Playmates, a semi-nude bar tucked amid the suburban sprawl. But she was far more than just a dancer. From her dining room table, she owned and operated her own entertainment company called Beauty and the Beast Entertainment, which delivered strip-teaseograms to private parties, bachelor events, and individual clients. She was an entrepreneur, a businesswoman, a single mom making it work in her own way. And around early 1991, she met someone, a man named Anselmo Tony Ortiz, though his friends called him Rocky. An Army veteran and divorced dad, he and Cynthia fell fast and hard. They spent every possible moment together, went on family outings with their kids, and on a notebook sitting on Cynthia's coffee table, she had written out in looping handwriting, surrounded by little drawn hearts, Cynthia Renee Ortiz. She was practicing her new last name. She was in love. She had plans. She had a daughter. She had a future. That future ended on the night of September 16th, 1991. On the evening of September 16th, Cynthia was supposed to send one of her dancers from Beauty and the Beast to perform at a private gig, but at the last minute that dancer had a conflict and couldn't make it, and none of Cynthia's other performers were available on such short notice. So Cynthia decided she would do it herself. But first, she needed to deal with childcare. Her 6-year-old daughter Jessica was staying with her that week, a special treat since Jessica normally lived with her dad. Cynthia called her estranged husband Donald and asked him to leave work early and come pick up her daughter. It was an abrupt end to a visit Jessica had been loving. The little girl cried as her dad loaded her into the car and drove her back to Azle, and Cynthia watched them go, tried her best to comfort her daughter before they left, and then she was alone. She got ready, she left to meet her client, and she never came home. The next morning, when Cynthia still hadn't returned, Donald Gonzalez reported her missing to the Arlington Police Department, and her car was found abandoned not long after. The discovery of the car so soon prompted investigators to immediately suspect something serious. This didn't look like a woman who had just walked away from her life. This looked like a woman who had been taken. Days passed with no sign of her. Her friends searched. Her family waited. Jessica, 6 years old and not yet fully understanding what was happening, was told only that her mother was missing. Then, on September 22, 1991, just 5 days after Cynthia vanished, police received a report of a deceased woman found in a rural area of Johnson County, Texas, out in the open countryside, dumped. The body was Cynthia's. She had been shot multiple times, and her remains had already begun to decompose in the late summer Texas heat. She was 25 years old. Back in Azle, a little girl named Jessica was sitting in her bedroom being comforted by her maternal grandmother when her dad walked in. He didn't ease her into it. He simply told her, "Your mom is dead and somebody shot her." Just like that. Jessica Roberts, that 6-year-old girl, would spend the next 34 years of her life waiting for someone to tell her who did it.
Arlington police detectives took over the investigation immediately. They had a body, a crime scene, and a deep question: who would want Cynthia Gonzalez dead? As detectives dug into Cynthia's world, a picture began to emerge. She and her boyfriend Tony Ortiz were serious. She had practically already taken his last name in her head. But before Cynthia and Tony got together, Tony had been in a relationship with someone else, a woman named Janie Hately. And Janie Hately, it turned out, had not taken the breakup well. According to police, Janie and Cynthia had actually known each other and been friends who frequently spent time together. But then Tony ended things with Janie to be with Cynthia, just several weeks before the murder. When detectives brought Janie in for questioning, the results were alarming. She had no alibi for the night Cynthia went missing. None. She couldn't account for where she was. She agreed to take a polygraph test and failed it. Then she agreed to take a second one and failed that too. And then, and this is the part that makes you do a double take, Janie Hately told detectives outright that she was glad Cynthia Gonzalez was dead, and that she had actually thought about either killing Cynthia herself or having someone else do it. She said this to police during an active murder investigation, and yet she was never charged. No alibi, 2 failed polygraphs, and a statement about wanting the victim dead, and still no charges. The reason comes down to a brutal legal reality. Polygraph results are not admissible in court in Texas. They can point investigators in a direction, but you cannot take them to a jury. And Janie continued to deny that she had anything to do with the murder. Without physical evidence, without a usable confession, without a witness who could put her at the scene, prosecutors had nothing they could bring into a courtroom. So the case sat. Investigators kept it open, kept chasing leads that went cold, kept trying. But time passed, evidence aged, witnesses moved on with their lives, and by 2011, the case was officially shelved in the department's cold case archives. Jessica Roberts kept calling. Every few years, she would pick up the phone, dial the Arlington Police Department, and ask if anyone knew anything new. The answer was almost always the same: "We're still working on it. There's nothing new to report." One such call came in May 2024. Jessica was now a wife and mother herself. She reached a homicide sergeant named Blake Ritchie, who didn't have updates but was clearly moved by the conversation, and he asked a detective named Anthony Stafford to pull the files and take another look. Stafford opened the digitized case files, sifted through hundreds of disordered pages, didn't find any obvious new leads or untested DNA evidence with potential, and set them aside. The case, it seemed, had hit another wall. But then something completely unexpected happened, and it started not in a police precinct, but in a university classroom. Her name is Patricia Eddings, and she is not the kind of person you'd expect to become the hinge point of a 34-year-old murder investigation. Short, with fiery red hair and a cheery Mississippi drawl. A former forensic analyst who had spent decades working high-profile cases before transitioning into education at the University of Texas at Arlington. In October 2024, Eddings attended a campus lecture delivered by Sergeant Ritchie about a different cold case, the 1985 murder of Terry McAdams, a UTA student beaten to death in her off-campus apartment, which had finally been cracked that summer through genetic genealogy. But toward the end of his presentation, Ritchie got candid about why cold cases were so difficult. Arlington's homicide unit had 6 detectives handling 15 to 25 new murders a year, plus a backlog of roughly 100 older cases. The moment something new came in, detectives were pulled off cold files, and by the time they could return, they had nearly lost the thread of the case's intricacies. It was almost like starting over every single time. Eddings heard that, and something clicked. Her students had something the detectives didn't. Time. Uninterrupted, undivertible time. The ability to sit with a file for weeks, read every single page, build a picture slowly, and ask questions without being pulled away to a crime scene across town. And beyond time, students brought fresh eyes, no preconceptions, no ingrained assumptions about how a case was supposed to go. When Ritchie's presentation ended, Eddings walked up and made her pitch. Would the police consider partnering with her undergraduate criminology students to review cold cases? She expected pushback because police departments are notoriously protective of open investigations. But Ritchie was receptive, and his supervisors were enthusiastic, and a new program was born. When the fall 2025 semester began at UTA, police delivered flash drives containing case files from 3 unsolved murders to Eddings' new brand course, special topics in crime and criminology, forensic assessment of cold case files. 15 students, 3 murders, no hand-holding. The files for Cynthia Renee Gonzalez' 1991 murder were the oldest of the 3, and they were assigned to a group of 5. Their names are J.C. Concannon, Jenna Lewis, Preston Schroeder, Natalia Montoya, and Samantha Underwood. And if you were picturing a room full of 20-year-old criminal mind monsters with a wall covered in red string and photographs, pump the brakes a little. These were regular undergraduates with part-time jobs and busy schedules and all the ordinary chaos of college life. J.C. Concannon, one of the oldest in the group, at around 29, had bounced around before coming back to school. She'd worked at an all-day breakfast chain, done stretches in the medical field, and came back to college with the goal of becoming a forensic scientist. Natalia Montoya was studying criminology while working shifts at Starbucks. Together, the 5 of them sat down, plugged in the drive, and began to read. They'd expected a large file, but 400 pages was still overwhelming at first, and then, as one of them later said, it became addictive. They were pulling at threads, building a picture, doing what good investigators do, reading everything and letting the patterns emerge. By their own account, many of them spent over 100 hours with the case material, arriving 2 or 3 hours before class started and staying 2 or 3 hours after it ended. They were obsessed, they were thorough, and 2 weeks in, they gathered around a table in the forensic lab to share their findings. It was Natalia Montoya who said it first. "This name keeps coming up." The name was Janie Hately, now going by her married name, Janie Perkins. Concannon's eyes went wide. "Wait," she said, "I noticed that name in another report." A third student had noticed it too. They cross-referenced everything, went back through every section of the file, and there it was across multiple documents spanning years of investigation. Janie Perkins, no alibi, failed polygraphs, a statement about being glad Cynthia was dead, and then, and this is the part that makes you do a double take, Janie Hately told detectives outright that she was glad Cynthia Gonzalez was dead, and that she had actually thought about either killing Cynthia herself or having someone else do it. She said this to police during an active murder investigation, and yet she was never charged. No alibi, 2 failed polygraphs, and a statement about wanting the victim dead, and still no charges. The reason comes down to a brutal legal reality. Polygraph results are not admissible in court in Texas. They can point investigators in a direction, but you cannot take them to a jury. And Janie continued to deny that she had anything to do with the murder. Without physical evidence, without a usable confession, without a witness who could put her at the scene, prosecutors had nothing they could bring into a courtroom. So the case sat. Investigators kept it open, kept chasing leads that went cold, kept trying. But time passed, evidence aged, witnesses moved on with their lives, and by 2011, the case was officially shelved in the department's cold case archives. Jessica Roberts kept calling. Every few years, she would pick up the phone, dial the Arlington Police Department, and ask if anyone knew anything new. The answer was almost always the same. We're still working on it. There's nothing new to report. One such call came in May 2024. Jessica was now a wife and mother herself. She reached a homicide sergeant named Blake Ritchie, who didn't have updates, but was clearly moved by the conversation, and he asked a detective named Anthony Stafford to pull the files and take another look. Stafford opened the digitized case files, sifted through hundreds of disordered pages, didn't find any obvious new leads or untested DNA evidence with potential, and set them aside. The case, it seemed, had hit another wall. But then something completely unexpected happened, and it started not in a police precinct, but in a university classroom. Her name is Patricia Eddings, and she is not the kind of person you'd expect to become the hinge point of a 34-year-old murder investigation. Short, with fiery red hair and a cheery Mississippi drawl. A former forensic analyst who had spent decades working high-profile cases before transitioning into education at the University of Texas at Arlington. In October 2024, Eddings attended a campus lecture delivered by Sergeant.
When the students flagged Janie Perkins and started asking specific, pointed questions about her, Detective Stafford went back to the files with fresh purpose. He found the witness statements, read them carefully, and compared them against the physical evidence in the case. According to police, those statements aligned with the evidence in striking ways that suggested the witnesses weren't repeating rumors, but were relaying specific, verifiable details about the killing. Details that, as Arlington Police Chief Al Jones would later say at a press conference, only a killer would know. On November 6, 2025, U.S. Marshals traveled to Azle, Texas, the same small suburb where Cynthia had once lived, where Jessica had grown up, where the ghost of all of this had been quietly haunting the landscape for decades, and arrested 63-year-old Janie Perkins on one count of capital murder. 2 days later, she was booked into the Tarrant County Jail, posted a $150,000 bond, and was released. For Jessica Roberts, now a wife and mother herself, the phone call she received about the arrest was almost impossible to process. 34 years. She had been 6 years old. She had spent her entire conscious life living with the question of who killed her mother. And now, finally, a name had been attached to a charge. She was emotional. She was grateful. She spoke about the students in a way that made it clear she considered them something close to family in that moment. "I am so grateful for this program and so proud of these students at UTA," Jessica said publicly, "and so thankful for the time they have spent and the effort they put into this case." It was by every measure a stunning breakthrough, and the story exploded nationally.
News networks ran it. True crime communities lit up because the idea of college students cracking a 34-year cold case captured something people desperately want to believe, that justice, even when long delayed, is still possible. But this story wasn't over, not even close. In March of 2026, a grand jury in Texas reviewed the case against Janie Perkins and declined to indict her. The case was declined due to a lack of admissible evidence. Let that sink in for a moment. No alibi, 2 failed polygraphs, multiple alleged confessions to multiple witnesses across multiple years, a statement to police about being glad Cynthia was dead, and still, a grand jury looked at what could actually be carried into a courtroom and said it wasn't enough. The brutal legal reality is this: polygraph results cannot be introduced at trial in Texas. They're investigative tools, not evidence, so a jury would never hear about those 2 failures. The witness statements describing Perkins' alleged confessions face enormous hurdles as hearsay over 30 years old, especially if witnesses have passed away or memories have degraded beyond corroboration. And the physical evidence from a body found outdoors after 5 days in the Texas heat in 1991 was always going to be limited in what it could yield decades later. Grand juries don't decide guilt. They decide whether there is probable cause to bring someone to trial. And even at that relatively lower standard, looking only at what was legally admissible, the jury said no. Janie Perkins walked free. And Jessica Roberts, who had spent 34 years wanting an answer, found herself holding the outline of one without the legal resolution that was supposed to come with it. This is the part of the story that is hardest to sit with, because the students did their job, the detectives followed the lead, the arrest was made, and then the system, at the last step, stepped back. There is a reason this case captured the country's attention and still lingers long after you've heard the basic facts, because it sits at the intersection of everything we wrestle with when we think about justice and its limits. It's about what happens to cases that don't get solved fast, in a country where the national homicide clearance rate has dropped from above 90% in the 1960s to around 50% today in many jurisdictions, where cases that go cold within the first year have historically very low odds of ever being solved. It's about what happens when law enforcement agencies don't have the resources to keep up with their own backlogs. Arlington, a city of 400,000 people, had 6 homicide detectives and approximately 100 cold cases, plus all the new ones arriving every year, and the math on that is brutal. There is no version of that situation where every old case gets the attention it deserves. And it's about what happens when someone thinks creatively about that resource problem, like a professor with red hair and a Mississippi drawl who heard a sergeant complain of bandwidth and thought, what if I gave him some? Eddings's idea was simple. Give criminology students real cases, give them supervised access to the files, and let them do what students do. Read obsessively, question everything, notice what people who've been staring at the same file for years might have stopped seeing. It worked, at least in the sense that it produced a result the previous 34 years of investigation had not. That the case then ran into the wall of admissibility is a separate and genuinely painful problem. But the model, students, professors, and police working together to breathe new life into cases the system has had to set aside, is a proof of concept, a glimpse of what is possible when institutions decide to collaborate instead of operate in isolation.
I want to come back to Jessica Roberts for a moment, because in a story full of dramatic twists and legal complexities, she is the human center of gravity that everything else orbits around. She was 6 years old when her mother was murdered. She grew up with almost no information about what happened. Her father became angry whenever she asked, held on to a big box of Cynthia's belongings, including clothes, keepsakes, a lock of hair, and a bottle of her signature perfume, Lauren by Ralph Lauren. And little Jessica, as a girl, would climb into that box and take naps inside it, sift through those belongings, press her nose against the fabric, and breathe in the scent of her mother, and try to hold on to something she had been given almost no time with. That image, A child curling up inside a box of her dead mother's things, trying to stay close to someone she could barely remember, is one of the most quietly devastating details in this entire story. Jessica grew up, got married, had a son of her own, and kept calling the police department, not because she thought it would necessarily lead anywhere, but because she couldn't stop. Because that is what you do when someone you loved was taken and the world never gave you a satisfying explanation. She deserved an answer. She got the outline of one, and then watched a grand jury say they couldn't take it further. At the time of this video, Janie Perkins has not been convicted of anything and is legally presumed innocent. The charges were not dismissed, they were declined at the indictment stage, which means it is theoretically possible for prosecutors to bring new charges if new evidence emerges, though that path is narrow and uncertain. For now, the case remains unresolved in the eyes of the law, and Jessica Roberts continues to live with that. This story doesn't have a clean ending. True crime content is often packaged in a way that promises you resolution, the killer caught, the case closed, justice served, roll credits, and this one won't give you that. What it gives you instead is something harder and more important, a window into the complexity of a system trying to do justice with limited resources across the erosion of time in a world where evidence ages and memories fade and legal standards are both essential and occasionally maddening. It gives us Cynthia Renee Gonzalez, a 25-year-old woman, a mother, an entrepreneur, a person who wrote her last name in a notebook with little hearts around it, who deserved to be fought for, and who for 34 years mostly wasn't. It gives us 5 college students who opened a flash drive and cared enough to spend over 100 hours of their own time chasing a lead in a case they had no personal stake in, who did it because the files were asking a question and they were determined to answer it. It gives us a professor who heard a cop complain about bandwidth and thought, I have something for that. And it gives us a reminder, a painful and necessary one, that the gap between knowing something and being able to prove it in a court of law is not a gap that always gets bridged. If you are watching this and you have information about Cynthia Renee Gonzalez's murder or about the events of September 1991 in Arlington, Texas, it is not too late to come forward. It is never too late. Cynthia Renee Gonzalez was 25 years old when she died. She had an auburn-haired little girl who cried when she had to leave her mom's apartment that last Monday evening in September. She had a man she loved enough to practice his last name. She had a business she ran from her dining room table. She had a life, and that life was taken on the night of September 16, 1991. 34 years later, 5 college students sat around a table in a forensic lab and said, "This name keeps coming up." And for a moment, a brief, electric, hope-filled moment, it looked like the world was finally going to answer for what happened to Cindy. The story isn't over. Maybe it never will be. Maybe one day it will. Until then, this is what we can do. Remember her, say her name, understand what it means when the system fails, and what it means when ordinary people refuse to accept that failure as final. Her name was Cynthia Renee Gonzalez, and she mattered.